I'm not going to be here for this class, but I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce to you Dale. And Dale is someone who has been steeped in the work of accompanying the dying process for, is it 30 years?
1970, I don't know, 30 years plus, 35 years maybe.
So his origins in this was at a time when this was not the common societal walk. So he was really a groundbreaker in this. He started the first spiritually based hospice in the country. And so there's a lot of depth here. So I know there's a lot of folks here who are oriented toward end-of-life work, so I encourage you, put your questions out there. It's very hard to fluster this guy with any question you come up with. I'm just going to answer that prediction. And and Dale also has roots in Vipassana as well. But he's here really to talk about that piece of things that is that end of life and what we can learn that's applied from that.
I know you're students and you're hungry to learn. At the same time, I would encourage you as much as possible to let today be the experience itself rather than about something. In other words, I will be talking about dying and about meditation and Buddhism and all those things. And hopefully there will be some really good information. But at the same time, I'd also like to do a meta presentation where what is going on in the room is preparing to die. And it looks like a rather mature group of people. So at any point, you can question, you can lie down in the back of the room, you can do whatever you want to do. Don't feel that this has to be really formal and that I'm the boss and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to turn this on. As Jan mentioned, along with Ram Dass and Stephen Levine, many years back ago in the 1970s, we started the conscious dying movement in the West. Because at that point, after the 1960s, it seemed that there was the consciousness explosion happening almost everywhere in the country, with the exception of the Oval Office and the encounter with death. And it really seemed that, in fact, living in a culture that is as physically preoccupied as ours is, that bringing traditional Dharma practices to the encounter with death and to the process of caregiving could potentially heal our collective fear of death. If you think about our past President George Bush, and just imagine that I had the opportunity to sit down and talk to him for an hour one-on-one, I would guess that there were nothing that I could say to him that would get him to change his mind about anything at all in the world. But if, on the other hand, his doctor said to him, George, I'm afraid to tell you that you have metastatic prostate cancer and that more than likely you only have 6 months to live, or that his daughter committed suicide, or that his wife had some horrible accident, one might guess that at that point there would be the vulnerability to come and talk to him and some meaningful change might actually occur. So that on one hand, I have a gig where I talk about death and dying, but the dirty secret is, on the other hand, that I don't find death much more interesting than anything else in life, but that it gives us a real opportunity to essentialize what it is that's going on. The most beautiful Americans I've ever met are people who are almost dead. Now, I have met the Dalai Lama and other saints and people like that who might be up there also. But in terms of people you meet, most of us are very busy collecting information, taking care of our bodies, pretty much most of the time fully identified with body and personality. And there is something in the New Age that goes like, you're going to die, but that's okay because you're really just living spirit. And in fact, Robert Bly pronounces New Age newage to rhyme with sewage for some reason. So there is some fuzzy thinking sometimes in the New Age. There's also a very beautiful foundation to it, of course. But if you or I think that we're our body and our personality only, and we're confronting death, death is the ultimate catastrophe. It is only when we bring in the dimension of living spirit and realize that you and I are living spirit, as well as body and personality, that death takes on a very, very different meaning and, in fact, becomes an opportunity. And I remember once in Santa Fe when I was running this dying center, I was writing a grant proposal for the dying center to some foundation that was located on the 29th floor of some building in New York City. And I was writing the incredible opportunity that dying can present. And then I thought about this guy on the 29th floor in New York City getting this and saying, what is he talking about? That more than likely that was not going to be something he could even begin to understand, or maybe even she. In those days, most of those people tended to be he, so please forgive me. But really, there are kind of two tracks to the things I do. And they come together, and I would like to present both of them today. One is working with conscious dying, and how, in fact, the Tibetans say that the time immediately preceding and immediately following physical death is the best, the most auspicious opportunity in an extended lifetime in which one can see one's true nature. The best opportunity for getting enlightened. Because right now, it really looks like there's approximately 25 people in this room, and some of us are men, and some of us are women, and some of us are older, and some of us are younger, and some of us have one color hair and some another. And in that dimension, you and I are all going to die. Can we look around the room with a different set of eyes and see, maybe not see in the way we usually think about it, that which is the same in each of us, that which is constant? Stephen Levine wrote a book, Who Dies? Do you die? What part of you dies? Who dies? Who lives? So, as we are embedded in body and personality, it is hard to remember that we're not just the body and personality. And it's even harder to remember that, in fact, right now, you and I are fully enlightened beings. We just don't remember that. It's not that enlightenment means getting something that you don't have already. It's not that it means you have to look another place. It means, in fact, one Chinese sage said, what you are looking for is who is looking. So death, the imminence of death, the certainty of death, can focus us in that way. It can focus us in the way that one asks, who is dying? What is really going on here? And can I, in fact, use this time in my life, these precious last minutes, days, hours, and weeks, to awaken? And even with a certain kind of training, can I use the time immediately following physical death? In the spiritual realm, dying is not just that very few moments where the heart and the brain stop functioning, but it's something that takes place over probably several days in which consciousness is leaving the body. Can I use that time following death, physical death, to see who I truly am? And in fact, later today, I would like to present my understanding of what happens when you die and in the moments after physical death. So that's one track. And certainly Buddhists have been in the forefront of exploring and then explaining their view of conscious death. right now in America, let's even backtrack. Let's start that sentence over again. When Ram Dass and Stephen and I started this work back in the very early 1980s, late 1970s, we thought that in 10 years there would be dying centers in every community in America, and the fact that we would be sort of the Colonel Sanders of death. That there would be, obviously this was such a fantastic idea that everybody would be doing this. And we grossly underestimated the persistence of fear of death collectively in our society. So that right now, the organizations whose primary focus is on conscious dying can be counted on the fingers of one hand. And that's 35 years later. There's the Living Dying Project. There's Joan Halifax's work in Santa Fe, the Upaya Foundation. Frank Ostaseski, who used to be the director of Zen Hospice Project, now has his own Meta Foundation. The Zen Hospice Project in San Francisco. And the Centers for Attitudinal Healing, which have places around the country that bring love and forgiveness to the dying process. Certainly, the work that these organizations that I've just mentioned have brought to our society has infiltrated, so that in every hospice and hospital around the United States, there are potentially people who have gone to a Ram Dass workshop or gone to a Zen hospice this or something like that, so that certainly there are, each hospice, each organization is as spiritual as the individual human beings that make it up. But you may find that when you go out into the world, that talking about conscious dying is not quite as well received as you might expect. And in fact, the Living Dying Project has a folder that we used to bring to Marin General Hospital and Kaiser Marin and stuff like that, that they could give to potential Living Dying Project clients, people who were approaching death and had some unmet spiritual needs. And I was told, and we're talking about Marin County here, this is the spiritual capital of the universe, right? I was told that the social workers could not give those brochures to their clients because it had the word dying on the cover. And even though the people were dying, it would be too frightening, and that we had to get another name. So we thought up the name of the project, the Open Circle Project, the Open Circle Program, which is a program of the Living Dying Project, but you don't get to that part until page 3. So at that point, maybe you figured out that we're not morbid or crazy after all. So that there is still an incredible resistance to what it is that we'll be talking about here today. That is one track. The other track is treading the spiritual path here in the West. I've been a meditation teacher for longer than I've been working with dying. And I began to see after some time that, and I've practiced Vipassana meditation, and I studied with Suzuki Roshi at San Francisco Zen Center. I've been to India, I've been to Tibet, and the whole great pedigree here. And at the same time, it really seems that here in the West, that many people, after they begin to meditate, come to a place not too far down the road where they bump into something or they get very distracted. After wondering about this for quite some time, I have come to the following conclusions: that the meditation practices, Vipassana, Zen, Tibetan practices, were developed 1,500, 2,000, 2,500 years ago, Hindu practices even longer ago, by people who were grounded and centered. People who were walking around barefoot, who loved their parents, who felt at one with the earth, so that when they began the process of disidentification with ego structure, they were doing it from an unneurotic stance. The Dalai Lama came to America, and it took him 3 visits to finally say, what really surprises me about you Americans is that you don't like yourselves. we just assume everybody likes themselves, so we can start letting go of these structures. But when you start disassembling ego structure on the foundation of a neurotic personality that is ungrounded, uncentered to begin with, you might guess that things don't go entirely smoothly. And in fact, many, many, many times when I am working with someone who is dying and they say, I want spiritual support for what I'm doing now, they need very basic body and fender work on the personality before we can really plunge into the profound opportunity that dying can present. I was at a Tibetan retreat once, and the Lama said, okay, we're going to do a meditation now, and first of all, imagine your parents and visualize how much you love them. He said, oh, wait a minute, we can't do that in America, can we? Because a lot of you don't love your parents. And he had kind of, and it's in a way slightly amusing, but it's in a way a very sad thing. So I am presenting American meditation. I'm facilitating groups that you're all invited to. They're ongoing groups. There's one in Berkeley on Monday nights from 6:30 to 8:30 over near Alta Bates Hospital. If you're interested at all, there are some flyers here. They're called Healing at the Edge. There's a couple in Sebastopol Tuesday afternoon and Tuesday evening, and one in Marin on Wednesday evening. Basically, I was very happily retired 2 years ago, living very well on the income I was earning from my Bernard Madoff investments. And one day I found out that I was broke the day before I was happily retired. So I'm back in the workforce, I'm leading groups, and actually it took me a while, but I really have to say that losing that money was one of the blessings of my life. That I probably wouldn't be here today if it were not for that. I would not be meeting you today if it were not for that. So I would be... Anyway, we don't... Let's not go down that road. Okay. So what we do in these groups, and what I would like to talk to you briefly about today, is that I put together a paradigm for the Westerner to evolve spiritually. And there are 5 different stages, and there are 3 tracks. One track is the track of the heart, the other track is the track of the body, and the other track is the track of the mind. It's kind of like Buddhism, devotion, and somatics. And the 5 stages are really something that I have plagiarized from Vajrayana Buddhism, from Tibetan Buddhism. In Buddhism, there is something called the 3 yanas. Y-A-N-A is a yana. Yana means vehicle. And because you're students, I get to give a little lecture here about what the yanas are. Philosophically, it's interesting. Historically, it's interesting. But practically, it's incredibly useful. Buddhism first developed with the historical Gautama Buddha 2,500 years ago. And his teachings were initially called Hinayana Buddhism. Hinayana meaning lesser vehicle. The Hinayana practitioners, Hinayana being Vipassana, don't like being called the lesser vehicle. So they call it Theravada Buddhism, which means the old school. And it's called the lesser vehicle because Theravada Buddhism is a practice. It's a school of thought designed to get you and only you across the ocean of suffering. It's a small enough vehicle to go across the ocean of suffering for one person. Historically then, Buddhism went east, Korea, Japan, China primarily, and became Mahayana Buddhism, the greater vehicle. And it brings into the mix compassion. And one begins practicing not for yourself, but for all beings. So if we were to meditate right now and say, let's do some Vipassana meditation and really watch your breath, and maybe you can get more aware and concentrate and feel better, that's one motivation. But suppose I say that there's somewhere between 12 and 20 million people who just became homeless in Pakistan because of floods. And can we become here collectively as we meditate together a force for healing, a force for compassion for those beings, for people you know in your life who are suffering, as well as to help alleviate your own suffering. And I personally find that given my own narcissism, I find that a much more powerful motivation than just doing it for myself. So that's the greater vehicle. Brings in compassion. And then Buddhism went back the other direction over the Himalayas into Tibet, and that's Vajrayana Buddhism, which I don't know if you've been talking about that at all in your module yet, but Tibetan Buddhism, they're kind of like the Roman Catholics of Buddhism. They have all these deities and all these... it's very complex, and I find it very appealing, and really they have gone into the understanding of working with dying more fully than probably any other school of thought on the planet, and train people to journey with the dying person even after physical death. So, in Vajrayana Buddhism, when you're practicing, there are these developmental stages. And the first stage, before you begin to practice, is you cultivate motivation. There are 4 truths that are called the mind-turning truths. And these are intellectual truths that are quite obvious to anybody who is at all intelligent. But the idea is that you contemplate them. You let them sink into your being and allow them to affect the way you look at the world. So the first stage is motivation, and these 4 truths are, the first one is, you will die, but you don't know when. Death is certain, the hour of death is uncertain. A wise person once said, the most amazing thing in the world is everyone is going to die, but everyone acts as if they were immortal. If you really knew you were going to die and you didn't know when, how would that change the way you were living? Last week, Thursday, I go in and have my blood drawn for a physical, and I'm waiting in the waiting room, and the phlebotomist starts screaming, "Help, help, help me!" And I and another guy go running in there, and she's screaming at this person who's like passed out, "Keep breathing, keep breathing." And then the next day I'm having dinner with a friend, and at the next table somebody started choking to death, and they started yelling, and who knows the Heimlich maneuver. I mean, it's like, and nobody died. But in either one of those cases, boom, one moment you're there, and the next moment you might be dead. Tennessee Williams died by choking to death on a nasal spray cap. So the assumption is that he put the cap in his mouth, he leaned back his head to put the nasal spray in his nose, and for some reason opened his mouth. And it went into his throat, and then he falls to the ground, he can't breathe, he's all alone, and he's thinking, I'm Tennessee Williams, and I'm choking on a cap from a bottle of nasal spray. How embarrassing is this? And that was the end of his life. One moment he's got a stuffed nose, and the next moment he's dead. So we all know that intellectually. But, okay. The second truth is that life is precious. Having a human incarnation in a body that's strong enough to be sitting here in a country that's free enough to allow us to talk like this, in a heart that's open enough to really even contemplate the things that we're doing here together, in a mind that can understand these things, is quite rare. It's a rare opportunity. Life is precious. And even beyond that, just going out into this magnificent Bay Area summer day, life is precious. How alive are we willing to be? The third truth is that there is suffering in this world. You suffer, I suffer. There are very few beings I've met in this life who don't suffer. There have been a few, but they have been few and far between, let me say that. There is suffering. And the fourth truth is that what you do, think, or say has an effect. There is karma. So that if you act one way, you create further suffering. If you act with greed, ignorance, it creates one thing. If you act with compassion and generosity, it creates another thing. So if we gather these 4 truths together as a bouquet of wisdom, if you will, and inhale as deeply as possible their fragrance. Is there then the motivation, is there then the inspiration to really find out who you are? To plunge into this process? Let me just read this Kabir poem. It's just the perfect poem at this time. Oh friend, I love you. Think this over carefully. If you are in love, then why are you asleep? If you have found him, give yourself to him, take him. Why do you lose track of him again and again? If you are about to fall into heavy sleep anyway, why waste time smoothing the bed and arranging the pillows? Kabir will tell you the truth. This is what love is like. Suppose you had to cut off your head and give it to someone else. What difference would that make? So if, in fact, we really get those truths, those four motivating, those mind-turning truths, that's the way we would feel. And in fact, I said there's 5 developmental stages. If you really, truly become the result, the affect of those truths, the spiritual path is done already. How could one act with anything less than total compassion? How could one do anything then be awake as you went through your day? But we can only take that in as deeply as our karma, our sanskaras, our neurotic structure, whatever you want to say, will allow. So because of that, there's a path. And the first stage of the path is this Hinayana practice of vipassana, of beginning to pay attention to what's going on, becoming mindful, becoming aware, invoking be here now, invoking being present, if you will. From the standpoint of the mind, this first stage, the first stage is motivation. The first stage of practice, the second stage, pardon me for being a bit confusing here. I call this second stage invocation. And from the standpoint of the mind, it's awareness, mindfulness. From the standpoint of the body, let me backtrack. From the standpoint of the heart, it's invoking from the depth of your yearning. It's calling out to the beloved. It's calling out to God, the Mother, the Buddha, the Spirit of Truth. Calling out from the depth of your heartfelt yearning. Prayer, mantra, the beginning of the path. And from the standpoint of the body, which is what's really been ignored here in spiritual practice, as far as I'm concerned, is getting grounded and centered. Now, the first thing that happens after a baby, the first thing that happens if the birth goes relatively well is that the child, the infant, learns to become grounded. First lying down on her back or on her chest, second sitting up, then standing, and then walking. Many people in our culture are not grounded. So that when you meet somebody, you can feel they're up here somewhere. And particularly, if somebody has an unpleasant experience or a difficult situation, the tendency is almost always to jump into the mental body and or the emotional body and not be in the physical body at all. So, from the standpoint of the body, invoking, being present means first of all getting grounded. And we will do a meditation later, but there's all kinds of information out there about being grounded. And then secondly, being centered in the belly center, hara, dantian, kath, depending on what tradition you're coming from. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that martial arts are done from the belly. So that there are these wonderful stories about very elderly, tiny, frail martial art masters who can throw a big, huge brute across the room without hardly flexing a muscle because the energy is pouring through their center. They are not doing the throwing. They are not using their energy. It's the energy, the chi, the shakti. So what we're talking here is about becoming a martial artist in terms of caregiving, in terms of being a chaplain. And if you are going to be a chaplain, you will be working on a very intimate basis with suffering. If you are doing that from a place of not being centered, you will get burned out, I guarantee it. One cannot be centered unless one is, first of all, grounded. So that's the physical aspect of invocation, centered and groundedness. So then we move on to Mahayana Buddhism, which is bringing into the mix the quality of compassion. When you're at the bedside of someone, when you're in a therapy room with someone, when you're looking in the mirror at yourself, first stage has happened. You're paying attention to, you're present physically, your heart has invoked, you're there in some kind of heartfelt way, and you're aware of what's going on. You're aware of your feelings, you're aware of what the other person is presenting, whatever the situation might happen to be. And often the demons that are arising are difficult enough that in an almost automatic way, distraction, denial arises because it is too painful to look at what exactly is going on. In my groups, there were many people who, when the oil spill happened in the Gulf, 2 or 3 months ago, and I don't know how long ago that was, were so overwhelmed with sadness for what was happening to the wildlife that they weren't feeling compassion, they were feeling despair. They were lost in feelings of despair. They could not allow compassion to be there for what was going on. And that's understandable. I'm not saying this in any pejorative or judgmental way. So compassion literally means with passion. Can you bring all of your passion, all of your open-heartedness to suffering? Stephen Levine very poetically describes compassion as keeping your heart open in hell. In other words, compassion is the same as love, but in the context where there's suffering. In fact, in the Vipassana tradition, even though compassion isn't one of the main components, there are qualities of metta, karuna, the 4 immeasurables that are concentrated upon. I think maybe tomorrow you'll be learning about these things, but people actually spend days, weeks, even months focusing on the feeling of compassion, on the feeling of loving kindness, or on the feeling of equanimity, or on the feeling of what's called sympathetic joy, which is the opposite of jealousy, the wish that the feeling of happiness at the well-being of others rather than feeling jealous. You're a writer, your friend is a writer, she got the contract, you didn't. Instead of feeling jealous, you say, oh, how great, my friend got the contract. Okay, that's sympathetic joy. Compassion can be spelled in 2 ways. It can be spelled with a small c or with a capital C. With a small c, compassion is something that we do, and that's the way we begin compassion, is you see suffering, you see somebody intoxicated on the sidewalk, or you turn on the news and you hear about floods in Pakistan, or you look at your relationship with somebody, or whatever it might happen to be, you look at your own self. And the first stage of compassion is opening my heart and feeling compassion for that situation. The deeper stage of compassion, with a capital C, is that compassion, in fact, is your true nature. You are compassion. The quality of the ground of being, the quality of who you truly are, is compassion with a capital C, so that eventually compassion isn't something that you do, but it's who you are. And that you allow yourself to be wide open and entirely vulnerable, and yet meet with tenderness and mercy all the suffering in the world, realizing that even 20 million homeless people can be met with the spaciousness of your heart. Let me read a short quote from Kaula Rinpoche, one of my first meditation teachers. I'll read it twice because there's a whole lifetime's worth of work in these 2 or 3 sentences. Live in illusion and the appearance of things. There is a reality. We are that reality. When we understand this, we will see that we are nothing. And being nothing, we are everything. That is all. One more time. We live in illusion and the appearance of things. There is a reality with a capital R. We are that reality. And we are that reality. When we understand this, we will see that we are nothing. And being nothing, we are everything. That is all. Now, the sentence there that's probably the most confusing is, we will see that we are nothing. And what they mean by emptiness in Buddhism, I don't know if this is something you've talked about yet, but emptiness doesn't mean you're really nothing. It means that we're empty of self. That our nature is space, is spaciousness. So that when we begin to surrender into, relax into, die into our nature, we become spaciousness. And we can meet the greatest suffering. And it goes through us like a cloud goes through a sky. Imagine the metaphor that your mind is a window. And imagine that through this window of your mind you can see the sky. Like today the sky is blue, you see the blue sky, and into this chunk of sky that is your mind, a gray cloud comes. A cloud of anger, a cloud of lust, a cloud of happiness. It doesn't have to be a negative cloud, a cloud of joy. If the window frame is small enough and the cloud is big enough, what do you see? You see gray. You say, I am angry. I am horny. I am happy. One becomes that passing mind-body state. One becomes identified with it. Now, then you become a student at the Berkeley Chaplaincy Institute, and you take these great modules in Buddhism and other things, and your window frame gets bigger. And now the same size cloud comes into that chunk of sky. And what you see is a gray cloud, but there's a blue border. Not only is there a border, you can see that the cloud is moving. It is a very different experience to see the cloud in the context of sky and to know that the cloud is moving and will be gone. Every cloud that comes will be gone. Even the cloud of identifying with your body and your mind. His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. Because in fact, think how simple your life would be if your motivation for each action were compassion. You weren't having to decide, will they like me if I do that, or will I be getting enough, or any of those questions. It's just, what is the compassionate action? Can I trust the spaciousness of my heart? And in fact, when I'm working with clients, or when I'm living my life in general, if I really trust my heart is open, I'll say and do almost anything. If I don't trust my heart, I fall back on being nice. Hey, why don't we just slow down a second here, and I've been doing a lot of talking. Maybe these things are more usually interactive. I could do this for days, as you probably can guess. So would anybody like to ask, say, comment, question?
I would like to ask you to repeat the name of your teacher who you quoted.
The Buddhist quote, his name is Kalu, K-A-L-U Rinpoche.
One of our readings was John Kabat-Zinn's Full Catastrophe Living.
Uh-huh.
And in one part of in the book was, there was a woman that had cancer,
Mm-hmm.
and she's, I think this is how it goes, said that she never admitted to the fact that she had the cancer. It was sort of a form of denial, but it worked for her. That was the point of him relaying the story. So when you were talking about the pamphlets that said dying and those not being given out,
Right.
I'm kind of confused. It seems like a conflictual.
Right. Well, I'm kind of curious what the book meant, or what John meant when he said that the denial worked for her. Could you explain how it worked?
I remember that too. It was a discussion of the effect of emotions and consciousness on cancer progression, I think. And if I'm getting this right, studied that the people who had either fully embraced and then had a fighting spirit in response to the cancer did better in their healing and diagnosis. People who kind of clamped down their feelings did well, and those who one totally denied it did as well, which I found amazing.
Okay, and this brings up a whole series of things. It's a very good question. I would like to point out that book was written a long time ago, and the study in question about breast cancer patients doing better when they got angry than when they just said, okay, I'm dying. The more I think about that study and the more I hear about other studies, and I'm not the kind of guy that collects studies even though I have a PhD in mathematics. I used to go to Berkeley here. I also went to Stanford. I'm a recovered scientist in some way. Maybe recovering is more accurate. Several things come up that certainly having the motivation, the energy. We talked about this whole thing starts with motivation. And that anger is a very non-specific, vague kind of English word. So people got angry when they found out they got cancer. Maybe they got really mobilized. Maybe they got really excited. This is a fight I'm going to do. I don't know exactly what these people felt. Certainly, it has been my experience that any energy that is tied up in denial is energy that cannot be used in healing. At the same time, it is not my job to drag anybody kicking and screaming out of denial. I run the Living Dying Project, so I have an easier job than most of you, because the people that come to me are looking at a brochure that says, we'll help you die consciously if that's what you want to do. Whereas you're going to be going into hospital rooms or hospice rooms or all kinds of places where people don't want to even talk about those things maybe. On the other hand, the more I do this work, the more I come to understand that the work is not about dying versus not dying. The work is about healing. And really, there is only possibly a day or two at the end of someone's life, maybe 3, where they're dying instead of living. So that the work is, the stuff I say in meditation class and the stuff I say in dying class is the same stuff, with a few extra tricks at the end of life for dying people that come out of Buddhism and other places. So I'd never ask somebody, do you want to die or do you want to not die? If you want to die, then we'll do this. If you don't, we'll do that. It's, do you want to be whole? Do you want to be healed? And if you want to be whole, then we'll do this work together. Some of it might not be easy. Some of it might be very confrontational. There is an implied or an explicit contract in my or your meeting with a client or a patient or a friend. And in fact, even the contract of meeting with a friend in America, in our modern society, friendship is usually an implied contract of, I won't confront you too much and you won't confront me too much, and we'll get along pretty well, and we'll call that friendship. And if you could really have a friend who could say anything to you and still love you and still have compassion for you, that would be a true friend. And even beyond that, when you look at the implied contract in a romantic relationship, usually there is a contract there that we want to put romance first and truth is a close second. And somewhere along the line, there is a conflict between romance and truth. And romance is chosen and truth suffers, and then that is the beginning of the death of romance, in my humble opinion. So I don't know if I've answered your question at all or not, but that basically, for somebody to say, I don't want to look at dying now. I mean, there are schools of thought. We had a client just lately in the Living Dying Project who is a member of, and I can't get these names, they all kind of confuse me, but it's something like the science of mind or religious science, where basically they try to keep a positive attitude, and that death is negative. Well, when death is negative, eventually you're going to have a real big problem in your life. But death isn't negative or positive. And to me, opening up to living spirit in each moment and being as alive as you can is the optimum strategy. But if someone needs to be in denial for their own philosophical or psychological reasons, then I don't feel it's my job to change their mind about that. However, I can be a living invitation to live another way. If I am the embodiment of compassion, then I come into the room and I'm not saying you should do this or you should do that, but I'm just saying, yeah, well, let's talk about baseball. Those Giants have really been sucking lately, haven't they? And, whatever. But that inwardly I'm living in that place. Then they have the opportunity to feel that and begin to participate or not. And I'll even give you an example, a very personal example. I helped both of my parents die. They each had cancer. And my father was a really great guy. Everybody loved my dad. He was all of my family were Danish Lutherans. I don't know if that gives you any sense of what I grew up with. Some people are laughing, some people look confused. But anyway, and my father was the president of every congregation that we were ever in. And I never saw him upset in my whole life. Never once. And at one point, 20 years ago or something, I was going to be teaching a workshop the next weekend in Berkeley, of all places. And I was driving in this car with my father and my mother and my romantic partner at the time and myself, somewhere out by Half Moon Bay, a beautiful sunny summer afternoon. And I said to my father, I'm teaching a workshop next weekend in Berkeley on death and dying. Do you want to hear what I'm going to talk about? And my father said, isn't it a beautiful day today? So he didn't want to talk about it. And I said, yeah, it's a beautiful day today. And then, 10, 15 years later, he was diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer. A lot of stories, a lot of things going on. But eventually, he was about a week from leaving his body. And I was in the hospital room with him. And I said to him, what do you think is going on? He could have said, isn't it a beautiful day today? But he said, he said, I don't know, what do you think? So he invited me in. And I said, I certainly hope I'm wrong. I certainly hope there's some miracle that happens here. But it looks to me like you're dying. So that strategy of presenting a provocative question, allowing the person to set the ground rules, can be a very skillful one. And after he said that, and I said, I think you're dying, he said, I think you're right, let's talk about it. We had the best conversation that man and I had in the 76 years of the, I wasn't around all the time, obviously, but in our lives together. And at the end of that conversation, he said, go home and tell your mother that I'm dying, that I want to talk to her about it. And I came home and said, Mom, Dad feels that he's dying and he wants to talk to you about it. And she said, no, he doesn't. And I said, yes, he does. And I brought her to the hospital, and they talked, and she crawled in bed with him, and she cried, and they held each other. And he died a very beautiful death, whatever that means. As did my mother 10 years later, whenever it was. And in fact, if all the training I've done in this work brought me nothing, then those two encounters with my parents as they died, if nothing else came of it, I would have been well served by all the practice I put in. Yes.
I work with people who are in assisted living, who are diminished, who are in their 90s. They know they're going to die. And they thought about it, or they haven't, but they don't want to talk about it now because they're not dying. They're not in those last days of dying.
Right.
And I think I'm learning that's really an essential aspect of the conversation. Probably, I'm going to want to talk about it a long time before, the week before I die. But I think that a lot of people take up their relationship to it, and they have the sense that if they spend too much time thinking about dying, they can't stay up in the taking care of the business of today. And I'm learning from these elders that that's fine. And I'm saying that because my experience isn't that it's denial.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last thing.
That it is not denial on their part. They're not denying they're dying. They're just saying, you know what, it's going to happen, and so what? And there's a lot more going on. I'm going to have lunch in a little while, and here's a thing to talk about or look at. So, it seems to me very easy to talk about the studies that you mentioned and things like that, and yet it's so personal to the situation and to the individual, how they want to do it. And my experience with these people is that they have the lead. It's their agenda. It's not mine.
I completely agree. However, I would say that most people I know in that generation don't want to talk about dying. And that I agree that what's for lunch and what's for dinner is more immediate than eventual dying. At the same time, I think it's a deep tragedy that there is such denial of death in our culture that people don't talk about it. My son is... He goes to school, obviously, and he gets training for his mind, and he gets training in athletics for his body. But nowhere in school do they even talk about the heart at all. I mean, it's like a completely ignored quality of a being, which is maybe the most important quality. We live in a culture that has some great benefits and wisdoms, but some incredible blind spots. And I would much rather be in a culture where people have talked about dying and how life is preparation for dying. How what we're doing here today is preparation for dying. It's not about dying, but I will never see most of you again after today. I mean, some of you come to a group, or I'll see you somewhere. Somebody was here from another group I was at. Where's the person from Santa Rosa? Oh, there you are. Okay. Backlit, I didn't see you. But most of you I'll never see again. This is our opportunity. It doesn't make it any more special than any other opportunity. But this is the time to be as fully alive with each other as we can be. Yes?
I actually have a comment about that. I don't know how many of you read the recent New Yorker article about end of life and hospice care, but it speaks directly to this, and it was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
I've been a hospice volunteer for a while, and the gist of it is that the people don't want to go on hospice because it means they think they're dying. But there was this town where all the doctors got together, and I'm simplifying here, and said, okay, we're going to give everybody the hospice talk.
whether they have 6 months to live or not. And they can choose hospice or not, we don't care. And those people did better, not if they went on hospice or not, but because they had to talk. And that just blew my mind.
And they spent a lot less money because they weren't doing all kinds of unnecessary, super expensive tests because they weren't so frightened. They had talked about something. So if these elders aren't talking about things because they thought about it and, hey, I'm cool, I'd rather just eat lunch now, and I'm this Zen guy, and lunch is coming, fine. But I would guess that a lot of those people don't want to talk about it. It's not your job to make them talk about it, but at the same time, I was talking before about being centered. And when you're not centered, working with dying people or suffering people can be kind of tricky because you hear what people are saying and tend to believe that. Whereas if you can be in your belly and somebody says something to you, and all of a sudden your belly feels kind of funny, like it's like your truth detector, your barometer, if you will, then maybe you have to ask a little more deeply. So as an example, I come to see somebody who's approaching death, and they want to be a Living Dying Project client, and they say, I'm ready to die, I really am ready to die, please help me die. And when they say that, something feels funny to me. And when I really start talking to them, what I find out is they're not ready to die, they don't really want to die, but they're afraid they're being such an emotional, financial, and energetic burden on the people that love them and care for them, that in their slightly codependent way, they would rather die than bother their loved ones. It's a very different message than I want to die. On the other hand, somebody will say, I don't want to die, I'll do anything to stay alive. And oops, something feels kind of funny there. And you talk to them more, and what you begin to find out is they're ready to die, they're okay with dying, but their intellectual worldview is that dying can never be okay. So their mouth has to say, I don't want to die, even though their body and their spirit is ready to die. So it's not that people are lying, it's just that they're not integrated. And by exploring some of these foundation practices of motivation, invocation, getting grounded, getting centered, then the compassion you bring to the client is such that, in fact, you can be dealing with a larger picture, a larger possibility of healing for that particular person and for yourself. And the other thing I would like to say as clearly as possible is that doing chaplaincy work or Living Dying Project work with the motivation of helping other people is a snake pit. That you've got to do it for yourself. You've got to do it as your spiritual practice. If you're doing it for somebody else, you're going to get burnt out and you're going to get confused. But if you go into that room with the intention of, I'm doing this as my inner contemplative practice, seeing how I'm here and I'm not here, where my compassion is and where it's not, then that person will be being served automatically in the best, most natural, spontaneous way possible. So let me just complete this little paradigm thing, and then then we can maybe take a break. So motivation, then there's invocation from the standpoint of the body, which is grounding and centering, from the standpoint of the mind, which is becoming aware, which from the standpoint of the heart, which is invoking in a heartfelt way, prayer or mantra. Invocation, motivation, invocation, then comes compassion, which we've talked about. Compassion from the heart. We can certainly talk about compassion from the mind. I don't find it quite so interesting. The Buddhists have whole books about the philosophy of compassion. But compassion from the body, from the energetic stance of the body, is very interesting. So if here's a question I'm throwing out to all you guys. If invocation, the very first stage from a somatic standpoint, is being grounded and centered, What is the somatic stance that supports compassion?
Receptive.
It's having appropriate boundaries. When suffering arises, there are three possibilities. Pushing it away, the stereotypical, maybe outdated example is the uptight oncologist who can't, so much suffering in his or her life that can't be dealt with. The second possibility, compassion arises, getting lost in it. The codependent social worker. Oh my God, your suffering is my suffering, what can we do here? The third possibility is compassion, having appropriate boundaries. And one can see, I think, intuitively, without belaboring the point too much, if you don't have appropriate boundaries, compassion is the attempt to be compassionate is going to get kind of confused and messy. So, backtracking, your boundaries will only be as strong as you have accumulated energy in your center. If you've got a weak center, if you're a wobbly kind of person, then your boundaries are not going to be that strong. And I am somebody, just by way of confession, I'm a very skilled meditator. I can go into all kinds of places that are really fantastic. But I had a very difficult, very early life in that, right after I was born, I had to be taken away because I had jaundice and put in a little box, and then I almost got electrocuted a couple times when I was a really little kid. So, even though I can do all these great meditative tricks, my main practice is getting grounded and centered. If I can be here when I'm grounded and centered, I trust my heart, I trust my wisdom. But again and again in my life, something comes up, and where did the grounding and centering go? And I would guess that for most people, that is the case here in the West. That you really have to create that firm foundation. The belly supporting the heart. And then going the other way, the heart softening your relationship with the demons that arise as you surrender into the belly. And beginning to work with that relationship between the belly and the heart.
Could you say that again? The heart softening?
So, there's the 7 chakras. We're basically dealing with 3 centers, the belly, the heart, and the wisdom mind. And the belly supports the heart. I think we all know, and we all are people who at times are very loving, and then something shifts a little bit, and all of a sudden, where's the love? Maybe you're in a relationship with somebody who at times is really there, and then, well, how come they're not there right now? It's because their heart is not stable, and their heart is not stable because they aren't deeply, fully embedded in their center. Okay? When you meet somebody who is residing in their center, it's an unmistakable experience. Somebody who's really solidly right there. Like that. Okay. At the same time, most of us are here from some Judeo-Christian background. There are a few dyed-in-the-wool, born and bred Buddhists and Hindus, but I don't see too many of them in this room. Maybe I'm wrong. That's a devotional tradition that we're talking about. And certainly one can find full wisdom and complete enlightenment by just going into your belly. However, it is a very steep and in ways difficult and cold path, in my view, when you don't bring the heart into coming into the belly. Because all of the unresolved grief, all of the repressed anger, all of those unfelt emotions, when you start going down into your belly, the dark deep, they will begin to arise. The demons will come out for lunch and have a party in you. So, if in fact you don't have the softness, the spaciousness of the heart, the mercy, the tenderness, to bring to the relationship with the demons as they arise from the belly, then it's going to be a lot more difficult. So, metaphorically, strengthening the belly, lower body like a mountain, mountains supporting the heart, heart like the sky, spacious sky, heart, sky above the mountain. And as much as you can bring this tenderness, this mercy, this compassion to your encounter with the demons, it will make it that much more workable. You can certainly battle your demons without the heart, just by strength and will and guts and awareness. But why throw out something that's probably a very strong part of who you are? So, motivation, invocation, compassion, Mahayana Buddhism, changing then into Vajrayana, developing into Vajrayana Buddhism. And Vajrayana Buddhism brings in the notion of empowerment, of you having certain empowerments in which deities, you are empowered to become deities. But only after you have gone through certain foundation practices, which traditionally are 100,000 full prostrations on the ground and 1,000,000 mantras, which probably most people in the West aren't signing up for. So they give these practices for anybody who's got $20 and walks in the door, pretty much. I've got a whole drawer full of them. And basically, empowerment is because there is enough compassion and enough spaciousness of the heart, which allows the mind to be stable, then you actually have the opportunity of becoming the deity that you begin to see because your heart is so open. Let's just suppose that your deity, just for the sake of language here, is Tara, the embodiment, the female embodiment of compassion. And you're given the empowerment of Tara. There's certain mantras, and you say these mantras and you visualize Tara. And then at the end of this visualization, you merge with her essential being. You become Tara, so that your words are the words of Tara. Your speech is her speech. Your mind is her mind. Your body is her body. You become the body of Christ, the mind of the Buddha, the body of the goddess, whatever it might happen to be. And you begin to experience in your life that what you are doing has a sacred quality to it. That is the stage of empowerment. And the final stage, the stage of wholeness, is non-duality. So in the Buddhist way of talking about things, there's a practice called Dzogchen. Maybe some of you have heard of that. After Vajrayana, you not only are the deity, but you begin to understand through a certain process of transmission that all experience, not just me is God, but everybody's God, everything is God. That is, you are, Adolf Hitler was, starving people in Pakistan. Doesn't mean that you don't do something about it with compassionate action. It doesn't mean that you like everything that you see. But it means everything is arising out of the sacred ground of being. Everything is arising out of the sacred ground of being. And that is enlightenment. That is wholeness. And in fact, that is traditionally even done as a healing practice, where if someone has an advanced cancer and they can begin to see that even the tumor is part of the sacred ground of being, maybe the tumor doesn't have a reason for being there anymore. So that is a quick summary of a paradigm for the spiritual path. And the reason I find it very useful is that you can begin to see that you're stuck in a certain place. You're stuck in a place like what I said about myself. I'm stuck right at the beginning in a bodily quality of not being able to invoke that. I need to focus more on grounding and centering. Maybe you need to work more with compassion of the heart. And you see how these things fit together. There's a book that is one of the few books that's changed my life. It's a kind of a dense book. It's called Hara, H-A-R-A, by a guy. His name is different depending on which book he wrote, but his first name is Karlfried, K-A-R-L-F-R-I-E-D, and sometimes it's Graf, G-R-A-F, sometimes it's Von, V-O-N, but his last name is Durkheim, D-U-R-K-H-E-I-M. Karlfried, he's a German aristocrat who became a Zen guy, and he wrote a book about being centered, which is the best thing I've ever seen about that. And the first half of the book is a little bit interesting, but not particularly profound. But the second half is about Hara in practice, about how to be fully embodied in your life as a chaplain, as a woman, as a man, as a mother, or whatever you are. And yes. Are you raising your hand?
Yeah.
What did you? Yes.
Well, it was Sharon was talking about our people in assisted living.
Yes.
It's like, it's like you're dying all the time. You know what I mean? Like it's
sure.
You can. My best friend died at 14. So it's sort of like dying's a process, and we're always kind of like in the process. People don't get, you get labeled, that you're dying when you get to be 80. I remember doing a workshop, Werner Earhart's people, and what we had to do was we had to be complete with, you had to write letters to people you didn't like. There were some people in the class that, had actually should have been in jail. He was, on the ground from his probation officer. So he had to call up his probation officer. Here I am. But by the time we finished this process, it was like I was ready to die. I was only in my 30s, but I was ready to die because there was nothing that was left undone. It was like there was a sense of completion. So, like if you told me, and I didn't even see that coming, you know what I mean? I just, they were saying you needed to be complete, But, like most people don't get that in our culture. There's not a sense. I remember they used to say never go to bed, they should always make up before the day. There's some Sharon's people are just scary. They're being labeled you're dying, and there's something scary about that.
Yeah, but I think I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you, but at the same time, isn't it possible to talk about dying with being labeled that you're a dying person? I mean, why can't we have a discussion about one of the most important events that's ever going to happen in your life?
Maybe because we don't have it all along.
Well, we have what all along?
We don't have the conversation in the culture all along, like everybody's trying to be 25.
Well, I'm not, but I'm glad I'm not 25. I would settle for 60 maybe, but...
No, but the conversation is always younger.
I don't quite get your point. What's the core thing you're saying here?
I'm saying
that these people are being labeled if there's the conversation happening about dying?
Pardon? I think if somebody all of a sudden labels you as a dying person, you might reject that, whereas the truth is we're dying all along.
Okay, I will completely agree with that, and I think you're bringing up an excellent point that suppose right now, instead of those Buddhas in the middle of the room, there were a bed with somebody in the bed who was obviously dying. Their breathing was very erratic. They weighed about 80 pounds. They were bright yellow. And we were all sitting around them watching this happen. It might be hard for you in your mind not to label this person a dying person. If Barack Obama walked in the door, probably everybody would see the President of the United States, like that. So that, and we go around carrying identities of being attractive or overweight or old or young or a dying person or whatever. To work with people who are dying, if you see them as a dying person, it incredibly and severely limits the contact with that human being. To see a human being who is in a body that probably will be dying soon is very different from seeing a dying person. And it's exactly that conversation about big and small window frame and the cloud in the window frame. So I hear what you're saying. I don't think we were talking about labeling anybody as dying.
Not labeling, but I'm not saying...
Well, that's what you just said. That's what you just said.
No. Hang on a second. Listen. Okay. I'm familiar with the population. Okay, so they're in an assisted living facility with others. And so I'm saying an invitation to have a conversation about dying maybe I should just throw out the word label. But an invitation to have a conversation about dying might be, well, oh my God, you know what I mean? And maybe nobody's ever kind of put that on you or said that, you know, this is true about you. You know,
what, that you're going to die one day?
I mean, I think at some level it's something that we run from in this culture.
Definitely.
And so, you know, they have to come up with, they may be kind of coming up with the reality of it for the first time.
I agree, and I'd like to kind of cut this kind of short here. I think we're going around in a circle that it would be really great if this could be talked about in third grade instead of when somebody's 80 years old. And when somebody's 80 years old and they've never talked about it, maybe to talk about it is too threatening. And that's a shame. And maybe if somebody is skillful enough to bring it out through sand tray play or in a secondary way so a conversation can start, so much the better. But, and certainly in an institution where every week they're taking a body out the front door in a bag, and everybody knows that's what's going on there, that's in the back of everybody's mind all the time anyway. They know death is in the lunchroom there, wherever it is, you know. So, you know, maybe they don't, but what I'm saying is that there are skillful and useful ways to talk about dying so people don't have to be afraid of it. That's really all I'm saying. So, finishing up this thing, and then we're going to take a break. There is that book by this guy, Carl Fried Durkheim, which, if you're interested in finding out more about centering, I would recommend that book. And the reason I'm bringing him up is because he also wrote this quote from another one of his books that I'd like to read as the parting quote before we have our 15-minute T&P break, I guess it is, right? The wheel of transformation. The person who, being really on the way, falls upon hard times in the world will not, as a consequence, turn to that friend who offers him refuge and comfort and encourages his old self to survive. Rather, one will seek out someone who will faithfully and inexorably help one to risk oneself, so that one may endure the suffering and pass courageously through it, thus making of it a raft that leads to the far shore. Only to the extent that one exposes oneself over and over again to annihilation can that which is indestructible arise within one. In this lies the dignity of daring. Thus, the aim of practice, of meditative practice, is not to develop an attitude which allows a man to acquire a state of harmony and peace wherein nothing can ever trouble him. On the contrary, practice should teach one to let oneself be assaulted, perturbed, moved, insulted, broken, and battered. That is to say, it should enable one to dare to let go his futile hankering after harmony, surcease from pain, and a comfortable life, in order that one may discover in doing battle that with the forces that oppose one, that which awaits one beyond the world of opposites. The first necessity is that we should have the courage to face life and to encounter all that is most perilous in the world. When this is possible, meditation itself becomes the means by which we accept and welcome the demons which arise from the unconscious. a process very different from the practice of concentration on some object as a protection against such forces. Only if we venture repeatedly through zones of annihilation can our contact with divine being, which is beyond annihilation, become firm and stable. The more one learns wholeheartedly to confront the world that threatens one with isolation, the more are the depths of the ground of being revealed and the possibilities of new life and becoming opened.